My child, do not move past this moment too quickly. Something about this message has found you at a strangely important time, and what you are about to hear was meant to make you look at your story from an entirely different angle. There was a room your soulmate entered recently, a room filled with polished glasses, quiet conversations, expensive surroundings, and people who appeared to have everything under control. It was the kind of private dinner where every chair seemed carefully chosen, every invitation carried meaning, and every person at the table understood that they were surrounded by influence. Yet heaven was not watching the wealth in that room. Heaven was watching one heart. Your soulmate's heart. Because before that evening ended, one simple question about you would change the atmosphere completely. Your soulmate did not arrive expecting your name to become the center of anything. They believed they could sit through the evening, speak when necessary, smile when appropriate, listen to stories of success, opportunity, travel, business, and dreams, then quietly return home with nothing more than another memory. But there are moments that look ordinary before they happen and unforgettable after they are finished. This was one of those moments. Something was already moving beneath the surface before your soulmate took their seat. They did not know it yet, but a conversation was waiting for them. A question was waiting for them. And somewhere deep inside, an emotion connected to you was waiting for permission to finally rise. The host of the dinner was a millionaire, someone accustomed to meeting people who wanted something. People wanted introductions, opportunities, approval, access, advice, investment, attention. Your soulmate noticed quickly how easily everyone adjusted themselves around this person. Voices became more careful. Stories became more impressive. Accomplishments became slightly larger. People were trying to appear certain of who they were. But your soulmate was strangely quiet. Their thoughts kept wandering somewhere else. Not toward the room. Not toward the money. Not toward what the evening might offer them. Their mind kept finding its way back to you. They tried to stop it. They looked around the table. They listened to another story. They responded to someone beside them. They even laughed at the right moment. Yet something about that elegant room made thoughts of you stronger instead of weaker. Perhaps it was because everyone seemed to be discussing what mattered most to them. One person spoke about the company they were building. Another spoke about the house they had purchased. Someone else talked about a future they were planning. Every conversation carried the same invisible question: what do you truly value? And your soulmate knew the answer appearing inside them was not what they expected. It was you. Not the idea of you. Not a fantasy version of you. Not merely your appearance or the memories that feel easy. Their thoughts were moving toward the complicated truth of you. Your tenderness. Your distance. Your strength. The moments you misunderstood each other. The things never said. The possibility that timing had separated two people who still carried something unfinished. They remembered details they rarely admitted mattered. A certain way you expressed yourself. A moment when you tried to hide what you were feeling. A conversation that ended too quickly. A silence that lasted too long. Something about being surrounded by people who could buy almost anything made your soulmate confront the one thing that could not be purchased. A genuine connection. And heaven says this is where the evening began changing. The millionaire host was observant. People like that often become skilled at noticing what others are trying not to reveal. Throughout the dinner, the host had been watching everyone carefully, asking questions that sounded casual but exposed something deeper. One guest was asked what they feared losing. Another was asked what they would do if money disappeared tomorrow. Someone laughed nervously when asked whether success had actually made them happy. The mood slowly moved away from performance and toward honesty. Then the host looked at your soulmate. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Your soulmate expected a question about work, ambition, or the future. Instead, the host leaned slightly forward and asked something much more personal. "There is someone you are thinking about tonight, isn't there?" The question landed differently than anyone at that table could have known. Your soulmate almost laughed it away. Almost. But the expression on their face changed before they could control it. Someone at the table noticed. Then another person noticed. Your soulmate lowered their eyes for a moment, and in that brief silence, your presence seemed to enter a room you were never physically inside. The host smiled, but not mockingly. Then came the question that changed everything. If that person walked through that door right now, would you still care about everything you came here hoping to gain? Your soulmate froze. My child, understand the weight of that question. This was not truly about a dinner. It was not even truly about wealth. It was about priorities. It was about the strange human tendency to chase what looks valuable while quietly wondering whether the heart has already chosen something else. Your soulmate had spent time trying to convince themselves that they could move forward without answering certain feelings. They had told themselves life was complicated. Timing was uncertain. Maybe distance was necessary. Maybe silence was safer. Maybe keeping certain emotions private was wiser. But sitting in that room, surrounded by everything people often imagine would make them feel important, your soulmate suddenly realized that none of it could answer the question happening inside them. Would any of this matter if you were standing there? And their heart answered before their pride could interfere. No. That realization frightened them, not because there was something wrong with caring, but because it exposed how much of their inner world had been organized around avoiding this truth. Your soulmate had been telling themselves they were simply thinking about you occasionally. They had reduced something meaningful into something manageable. They had placed your memory into a small corner of their life and called it nostalgia. They had told themselves they were being practical. But practical feelings do not make a person forget an entire room. Practical feelings do not make someone struggle to answer a stranger's question. Practical feelings do not make a heart suddenly race because someone indirectly mentioned the person you have been trying not to miss. The millionaire did not press immediately. That made the moment even stronger. Everyone went back to eating for a few seconds, but the atmosphere had shifted. Your soulmate could feel it. Their own silence felt louder than the conversation around them. They reached for their glass, then stopped. They glanced toward a window across the room where city lights stretched into the distance. And somewhere in that reflection, they remembered you again. Not one memory this time. Many. The first moment they realized you were different. The first conversation that stayed in their mind longer than expected. The moment they wondered whether you felt the connection too. The first misunderstanding. The first time they considered saying more but decided against it. Perhaps there had been a moment when they nearly reached out. Perhaps there had been a message written and deleted. Perhaps words had lived inside them for months without ever becoming sound. Whatever form your story has taken, the emotional truth remained the same. Something unfinished had followed them into that room. The host eventually returned to the subject, but now the tone was softer. What is stopping you? 4 words. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. And this is where heaven wants you to pay attention, because the answer forming inside them was not what anyone expected. They could have blamed circumstances. They could have blamed timing. They could have blamed you. But in that moment of unexpected honesty, your soulmate realized the biggest obstacle had been fear. Not fear of you. Fear of what you awakened in them. There are people we meet who fit neatly into the life we already understand. They require no transformation. They ask nothing deeper from us. We can predict how we will behave around them. We know what role to play. Then there are people whose presence exposes the parts of us we have been avoiding. For your soulmate, you became connected to that deeper category. Thinking about you forced them to confront questions they could avoid everywhere else. Am I living truthfully? Am I choosing safety over connection? Am I protecting my heart or imprisoning it? Have I confused control with peace? Have I been waiting for certainty when love has never promised certainty? These questions had been following them quietly. At that dinner, they finally became impossible to ignore. The millionaire host had seen many people sacrifice relationships for status, and many others discover too late that success could not replace intimacy. Perhaps that was why the host's next words carried unexpected weight. Be careful, they said, not to become so busy building a life that you lose the person you secretly wanted to share it with. Your soulmate looked up. Something inside them cracked open. Not dramatically. No one stood up. No music suddenly stopped. There was no theatrical scene. But internally, something shifted. Because your soulmate had imagined a future many times. They had pictured accomplishments, stability, travel, perhaps a beautiful home, perhaps recognition, perhaps peace. Yet when they examined those images honestly, a strange pattern appeared. You were hidden somewhere inside many of them. Sometimes clearly. Sometimes only as a feeling. A person beside them whose face their mind refused to name. A conversation at the end of a long day. Someone understanding the part of them nobody else saw. Someone they could return to after the world stopped applauding. And suddenly your soulmate realized that whenever they imagined being truly known, some part of them had been imagining you. That realization made the dinner feel almost unreal. They began wondering where you were at that exact moment. Were you awake? Were you thinking about them too? Had you already decided to let go? Had someone else begun occupying the emotional space they had been afraid to enter? Was life moving you somewhere they could no longer reach? That last question hit hardest. What if waiting had a cost? Your soulmate had always believed there would be more time. More time to become certain. More time to understand the connection. More time to decide whether to speak. More time to resolve everything internally before risking anything externally. But life had never promised that. People change. Doors close. Hearts learn to protect themselves. A person who once waited may eventually choose peace instead. And your soulmate suddenly understood that silence is also a decision. The host noticed the change in their expression. So, the millionaire asked, what would you say if you knew you could only say one honest thing? Your soulmate swallowed. Nobody interrupted. The room felt strangely intimate now, despite the number of people around the table. Your soulmate looked down for several seconds. Then they answered. I would tell them I never stopped caring. My child, that sentence was not planned. That is why it mattered. It came from the place beneath rehearsed explanations. Beneath pride. Beneath all the stories they had used to make their own behavior understandable. It came from the part of them that still recognized your significance even while another part tried to move forward. Someone at the table quietly asked, "Do they know?" Your soulmate's expression changed again. No. One word. But that one word carried regret. The host did not criticize them. Instead, they asked something even more uncomfortable. Then how are they supposed to know? Your soulmate had no answer. And perhaps that is part of the reason this message has found you now. Not because you should chase. Not because you should force meaning onto silence. Not because every feeling automatically becomes a relationship. But because sometimes two people can carry enormous emotional truths while making decisions based only on what has been spoken aloud. Your soulmate began realizing how much they had expected you to somehow understand without being told. They thought you would notice small signs. They thought you would recognize certain pauses. They thought you would interpret their distance correctly. They thought you would sense what they were hiding. But human hearts cannot survive forever on assumptions. Sometimes love needs language. Sometimes care needs courage. Sometimes the person on the other side has no idea what silence supposedly means. And that truth became painfully clear at the dinner. Your soulmate remembered moments when you may have needed reassurance but received uncertainty instead. Times when you might have wondered whether you mattered. Moments when their inconsistency could have looked like indifference. Perhaps they disappeared emotionally when they should have explained themselves. Perhaps they acted unaffected when they were deeply affected. Perhaps they let you walk away from a conversation believing something completely different from what they actually felt. They began replaying everything. And one particular memory returned stronger than the others. A moment involving your eyes. There had been a time when you looked at them as though you were waiting for something. Maybe an answer. Maybe honesty. Maybe courage. Your soulmate remembered looking away, changing the subject, or choosing silence. At the time, they thought they were protecting themselves. At the dinner, they suddenly wondered whether that was the exact moment they hurt you. This possibility unsettled them. Because regret feels different when you realize your silence may have written a story in someone else's heart that was never true. Your soulmate had never wanted you to feel unimportant. They never wanted you to believe you were easily replaced. They never wanted you to think the connection meant nothing. Yet wanting is not always enough. People experience what we show them, not only what we secretly feel. That evening became a mirror. And your soulmate was finally looking. The millionaire eventually shared something personal too. Years earlier, they had apparently chosen ambition over someone they deeply cared about. They told themselves they would return once life became more stable. Once the business succeeded. Once they felt worthy. Once they had more to offer. But by the time they were ready, the other person had moved on. The host did not tell the story dramatically. That made it more powerful. They simply said, "I gained almost everything I once thought would make me ready." But readiness arrived after the moment had passed. Your soulmate went completely still. Something about those words felt less like advice and more like a warning from their own possible future. What if they were doing the same thing? What if they had been waiting to become fearless before being honest? What if they had been trying to create the perfect version of themselves before allowing you to see the real one? What if they were assuming you would still be available whenever they finally decided to speak? That thought became unbearable. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because until that evening, your soulmate had believed they were the one with time on their side. But suddenly, they wondered whether you had changed. Whether your heart had become stronger. Whether you had started seeing the situation differently. Whether you had finally stopped waiting for clarity from someone who kept offering questions. Perhaps they sensed something about you that night. A distance. An independence. A quiet energetic shift. Not necessarily because you had stopped caring, but because you had begun learning that your worth could not depend on another person's indecision. That possibility awakened something inside them. They imagined you building a life that did not revolve around waiting. They imagined you laughing with someone new. They imagined another person seeing your value clearly, without hesitation. They imagined someone else asking you the questions they had been too afraid to ask. And for the first time, your soulmate understood jealousy in a form they did not expect. Not possessiveness. Regret. The painful recognition that someone else could receive the version of you they had been too uncertain to fully appreciate. They tried to dismiss the thought. But it returned. What if someone else chooses you while I am still trying to decide whether I am brave enough? That question followed them through the rest of dinner. The conversations continued, but your soulmate was no longer truly participating. Something had opened that could not easily be closed again. They were thinking about timing. About courage. About how strangely life arranges moments of revelation. They had entered the dinner expecting perhaps to learn something about success. Instead, they were learning something about love. Then the host did something unexpected. They asked everyone at the table to answer one final question before dessert. What is one truth you have been avoiding because admitting it would require you to change something? Different answers moved around the table. Someone admitted they hated the career they had spent years building. Someone confessed they wanted to repair a relationship with a sibling. Another person admitted they were exhausted from pretending to be happy. Then it reached your soulmate. For several seconds, they said nothing. Their heart was pounding now. They could give a safe answer. Everyone probably expected something general. But the evening had already stripped away too many excuses. Your soulmate inhaled. Then said something that surprised even themselves. I think I have been pretending I could lose someone and be okay with it. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. The host looked directly at them. And can you? Your soulmate shook their head. No. The honesty of that answer stayed in the room. But what happened next went even deeper. The millionaire leaned back and studied your soulmate carefully. Then asked, does this person know how important they are to you? Again, silence. Your soulmate's eyes lowered. I don't think so. Why? Your soulmate hesitated. And this time, the answer was complicated. Because they were afraid of needing you. Afraid of being rejected. Afraid that expressing how deeply they cared might shift the balance between you. Afraid that you might not feel the same. Afraid that you might feel exactly the same, because then something real would actually have to happen. That is the strange contradiction of the heart. Sometimes people say they want love while quietly building walls against everything love requires. Vulnerability. Uncertainty. Honesty. Change. Your soulmate suddenly saw how many walls they had built. And your name seemed written on the other side of every one. The dinner was nearing its end now, but the real story was only beginning. Your soulmate excused themselves briefly and stepped away from the table. They needed space. They walked through a quiet corridor toward a balcony or private outdoor area where the sound of the dinner faded behind them. The night air felt different. They looked out over the city. Thousands of lights. Thousands of lives. Thousands of people loving, leaving, hoping, regretting, beginning again. And somewhere among all those lives was you. Your soulmate pulled out their phone. Your name was closer than they wanted to admit. Perhaps in their contacts. Perhaps inside an old conversation. Perhaps somewhere they had visited many times without ever pressing send. Their thumb hovered. They thought about writing something simple. "Are you awake?" Then deleted it. They tried again. "I was thinking about you." Deleted. Again. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." They stared at the sentence. Their heartbeat changed. Because once certain words are sent, the story cannot return to exactly what it was before. They were standing at the edge of a decision. And my child, heaven was not forcing them. Heaven does not need to manipulate what truth can reveal naturally. Instead, the moment simply showed them what had been there all along. They cared. More than they had admitted. They regretted more than they had shown. And somewhere inside them, the possibility of losing you had become more frightening than the possibility of finally being honest. But they still did not press send. Not yet. Because another thought entered their mind. What if you no longer wanted to hear from them? Your soulmate suddenly remembered every delay. Every mixed signal. Every time they could have been clearer. They wondered whether contacting you now would be too late. They wondered whether you had already closed the door emotionally. They wondered whether you might read their message and feel nothing. That possibility made them put the phone down. For a moment, fear returned. But then the balcony door opened. The millionaire had followed them. Not intrusively. Quietly. The host stood a short distance away and looked out over the same city lights. "I know that look," they said. Your soulmate gave a small, nervous smile. "What look?" "The look of someone who has finally discovered what they want and is now terrified that they waited too long." Your soulmate did not deny it. The host continued. "There is something people misunderstand about courage. They think courage means believing the outcome will go their way. It doesn't. Courage is deciding that truth matters even when you cannot control what happens after you speak it." Your soulmate looked at the phone again. Those words landed deeply. Because they had been waiting for certainty. But maybe certainty was never coming. Maybe the only thing available was honesty. And maybe honesty was enough. Your soulmate unlocked the phone again. This time they did not begin with, "Are you awake?" They did not begin with a casual excuse. They started writing something different. Something longer. Something dangerously close to the truth. They wrote about the dinner. About the question. About how unexpectedly your name had filled their mind. About how tired they were of pretending certain feelings had disappeared. They admitted that there were things they wished they had handled differently. They admitted that silence had been easier than vulnerability. They admitted that some part of them had always wondered whether your story together was truly over or whether it had never been given the chance to fully begin. The words kept coming. Your soulmate surprised themselves. It was as though months of unspoken emotion had been waiting behind one locked door, and the dinner had finally handed them the key. Then they wrote a sentence that made them stop breathing for a second. I think I was more afraid of how much you mattered than I was willing to admit. They stared at it. Read it again. Their finger hovered near send. But before they could decide, the host asked one final question. And this, my child, is the question that changed the meaning of the entire evening. The millionaire looked at your soulmate and said, before you send that, answer me honestly. If this person told you tonight that they were ready to walk away forever, what would you do? Your soulmate's face changed instantly. The answer came before thought. I would go to them. The host nodded slowly. Then why are you still standing here? Your soulmate looked at the phone. Then toward the city. Then back at the unfinished message. Something powerful moved through them. For the first time that night, the decision no longer felt like whether they should tell you the truth. The decision had become how far they were willing to go once they admitted it. And that is when something happened that nobody at that dinner could have predicted. Because just as your soulmate looked down at the screen again, preparing to finish the message, a notification appeared. Not from the millionaire. Not from anyone at the dinner. Something connected to you. Your soulmate stared at the screen. Their expression changed. Whatever they saw made their hand tremble slightly. The host noticed. What happened? Your soulmate did not answer. They kept staring at the phone as though the timing itself was impossible. Because the very person they had spent the entire evening trying to understand had suddenly appeared in front of them in a way they were not prepared for. And what they saw next made them realize that this was no longer only about admitting the past. Something had changed in your life. Something they did not know. Something that could force them to make a decision much sooner than they ever expected. Your soulmate opened the notification. Their eyes moved across the screen. Then stopped. The unfinished confession was still there beneath it. One message they had not yet sent. One truth they had not yet spoken. And now, one unexpected discovery about you that made the millionaire quietly ask, "Are you sure you still have time?" Your soulmate looked up, stunned. Because the answer was suddenly no longer obvious. And before the night ended, they would have to choose whether to remain silent one more
time, or finally do something that could change both of your lives. The night had not finished speaking. Your soulmate stood beneath the quiet glow of the city, holding the phone as though something inside that small screen had suddenly become heavier than everything waiting behind those glass doors. A few minutes earlier, they had been surrounded by conversations about success, influence, wealth, opportunity, and futures carefully designed on paper. Now none of those things seemed important. The millionaire's question remained suspended between them like an echo that refused to disappear. Are you sure you still have time? Your soulmate did not answer, because what had appeared on the screen had touched the exact fear they had been trying to avoid all evening. Something about you suggested movement, change, not necessarily the ending they feared, but enough to remind them that your life had never been frozen while they tried to understand their feelings. You had been living too, growing, learning, healing from disappointments nobody completely understood. becoming more aware of what you deserved. And perhaps, without your soulmate realizing it, you had begun stepping into a version of yourself that no longer waited endlessly for someone else to become certain. That realization moved through them like a quiet shock. For so long, your soulmate had unconsciously imagined you as emotionally available somewhere in the background of their life. Even during distance, even during silence, even during those periods when neither of you knew what the other was truly thinking, there had been an assumption hidden beneath everything. If they eventually found the courage, perhaps you would still be there. But tonight had shattered that assumption. The millionaire looked at them carefully. You look like someone who just realized another person has a life beyond your hesitation. Your soulmate slowly lifted their eyes. The words were uncomfortable because they were true. They had been thinking almost entirely about their own fear, their own uncertainty, their own timing, their own need to feel ready. They had rarely stopped to imagine what their silence had required from you. How many nights had you questioned what something meant? How many times had you replayed conversations? How often had you wondered whether their distance meant they did not care? How many moments had you wanted clarity and received another mystery? Your soulmate suddenly saw the story from your side, and the picture was painful, because what they had experienced internally as fear may have looked externally like indifference. What they called caution may have felt to you like rejection. What they called waiting for the right moment may have felt like being placed second. The realization changed something. Your soulmate returned their attention to the unfinished message. The sentence was still there. I think I was more afraid of how much you mattered than I was willing to admit. They read it again. For the first time, they did not delete it. But they did not send it either. Not yet. Something deeper had to happen first. The millionaire stepped closer to the balcony railing and said quietly, "You know what people regret most?" Your soulmate looked over. Losing someone. The millionaire shook their head. No. Sometimes people leave, and sometimes that is necessary. The deeper regret is knowing you never gave the truth a chance. Those words entered your soulmate differently. Because losing you after being honest would hurt. But losing you because they had never been honest at all? That would become a question they might carry for years. What if I had spoken? What if I had called? What if I had admitted what I felt? What if one conversation could have changed everything? My child, there are moments when the future seems to narrow into one small doorway. Your soulmate was standing in such a moment now. They could return to the dinner, laugh politely, finish the evening, drive home, sleep badly, wake tomorrow, and eventually convince themselves that silence had once again been the responsible choice. Or they could do something different. Not dramatic, not reckless, simply honest. Your soulmate looked at the phone again and began editing the message. They removed the careful language. They deleted the phrases designed to protect them if you responded badly. They erased the sentences that sounded like explanations instead of truth. Then they started again. I don't know what this message will change, but tonight someone asked me a question I couldn't answer without thinking about you. They paused, then continued. I realized I have expected you to understand things I never had the courage to say. That wasn't fair. Another pause. Their heart was beating harder. I don't know where your heart is now, and I won't pretend I have the right to decide that for you. But I need you to know that what happened between us mattered to me more than I showed. Your soulmate stopped typing. That sentence exposed them. And strangely, instead of feeling weaker, they felt something loosening inside. For months, perhaps longer, they had been spending emotional energy hiding from the very truth now appearing on the screen. The truth was not complicated. You mattered. You had mattered. And pretending otherwise had not created peace. It had created distance. The millionaire glanced toward the phone, but did not ask to read anything. This isn't about getting the answer you want, the host said. Remember that. Your soulmate nodded. It was important. Because genuine honesty cannot become a demand. They could tell you how they felt. They could apologize for what they had mishandled. They could explain what they had been afraid to say. But they could not control what you did with that truth. And perhaps that was the lesson your soulmate had avoided all along. Love without control requires courage. Your soulmate returned to the message. They wrote another line. If you have moved forward, I will respect that. But I don't want you moving forward believing you meant nothing to me. That was the sentence that nearly broke them. Because they suddenly imagined that perhaps you had done exactly that. Perhaps you had spent time convincing yourself that you imagined the connection. Perhaps you had questioned your intuition. Perhaps you had wondered why something could feel meaningful and still become so confusing. Perhaps eventually you had decided the simplest explanation was that your soulmate simply did not care enough. The possibility hurt them deeply, not because they believed you owed them another chance, but because they realized their silence may have allowed you to carry a false version of the truth. Your soulmate whispered almost unconsciously, "I should have told them." The millionaire heard. "Yes," the host replied. "Maybe you should have." There was no comforting lie in the response. No promise that everything would work out perfectly. Only truth. Then the host added, "But the question isn't what you should have done. The question is what kind of person you choose to be now." Your soulmate looked toward the city again. That question reached beyond you. It reached into their identity. Because perhaps this entire evening was not simply about whether they contacted you. Perhaps it was about whether they would continue living as someone who allowed fear to make decisions on behalf of their heart. Your soulmate had done that before. They had delayed conversations, hidden tenderness, pretended not to care, waited for other people to move first. They had sometimes mistaken emotional restraint for strength. But standing there now, they saw another kind of strength. The strength to say, "I care," without knowing what happens next. The strength to say, "I was wrong," without defending the mistake. The strength to say, "You mattered," without demanding that the other person return. And suddenly the millionaire's private dinner no longer felt accidental. Your soulmate had entered a room filled with people who appeared powerful, only to discover that the greatest power they lacked was the courage to speak honestly to one person. You. Inside the dining room, someone called the host's name. The millionaire turned toward the door, then stopped. Before leaving, they looked at your soulmate one last time. "I'll tell you something nobody told me when I needed to hear it." Your soulmate waited. Money can replace many mistakes. Time cannot. Then the host disappeared inside.
Your soulmate remained alone. And now there was nothing left between them and the decision. They looked at the message. Read every sentence. Changed one word. Then another. Their thumb moved toward send. Stopped. Moved away. They locked the phone. Unlocked it again. My child, this hesitation was not because the feeling had disappeared. It was because the feeling had become undeniable. Sometimes the closer people move toward truth, the louder fear becomes. Your soulmate imagined every possible response. Maybe you would answer immediately. Maybe you would wait. Maybe you would say you had been waiting to hear those words. Maybe you would tell them they had waited too long. Maybe you would be kind but distant. Maybe you would not respond at all. Every possibility created a different future. And your soulmate wanted certainty before choosing one. But there was no certainty. Only the truth. They closed their eyes. Then another memory surfaced. A conversation between you that had once seemed insignificant. Perhaps you had said something like, "I just want honesty." At the time, your soulmate had heard the words but not understood their depth. Now they did. You had not necessarily needed perfection. You had needed something real. And perhaps your soulmate had been so busy trying to avoid making the wrong move that they made the one mistake that created the most confusion. They gave you too little truth. That memory changed the hesitation. Your soulmate opened their eyes. Then pressed send. The message left. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the screen displayed the confirmation that the words were no longer theirs alone. They had crossed the distance. Your soulmate inhaled sharply. There was no taking it back now. No editing. No pretending. Somewhere, whenever you saw it, you would finally know. The strange thing was that the moment after sending did not feel like disaster. It felt like release. Your soulmate had spent so long fearing vulnerability that they had forgotten how exhausting secrecy could become. For the first time in a long while, the truth existed outside them. They leaned against the railing. Then laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the absurdity of the evening had finally reached them. They had accepted an invitation to a millionaire's dinner imagining they might encounter influential people or useful conversations. Instead, they had ended up confessing feelings about you to themselves. But heaven was not finished with the night. Because when your soulmate returned to the table, the atmosphere had changed again. Dessert had arrived. Conversations were lighter. Someone asked whether everything was okay. Your soulmate smiled and said yes. And for once, the answer was almost true. They still did not know what would happen. But something inside them felt aligned. The millionaire looked across the table and immediately understood. You sent it? Your soulmate nodded. The host smiled. Good. Then another guest, someone who had been listening quietly earlier, said something unexpected. Whatever happens, don't ruin the honesty by becoming impatient. Your soulmate turned toward them. The guest continued. People sometimes finally tell the truth and then immediately demand an answer because vulnerability makes them uncomfortable. Give the other person space to feel whatever they feel. Your soulmate absorbed those words carefully. Because they knew this was important. If they truly cared about you, then your response had to belong to you. Not to their expectations. Not to their urgency. Not to their fear. You deserved the freedom to decide what the truth meant for your life. And this understanding marked another change. Your soulmate was no longer thinking only, how do I get this person back? They were beginning to think, how do I treat this person honestly? There is a difference. One comes from fear of loss. The other comes from love matured by respect. Your soulmate sat back down. Minutes passed. They resisted checking the phone. Then checked anyway. Nothing. They placed it face down. Someone started telling a story. Your soulmate tried listening. 30 seconds later, they checked again. Still nothing. Their stomach tightened. The old fear returned immediately. Maybe you had seen it and decided not to answer. Maybe the message had arrived at the worst possible time. Maybe that notification earlier truly meant you had moved forward. Maybe. Your soulmate stopped themselves. The guest's words returned. Give them space. So they put the phone away. But then the millionaire asked another question. Not about you this time. About your soulmate. What do you think you deserve? Your soulmate seemed confused. In what sense? In love. The table grew quieter. Your soulmate thought carefully. They almost gave an easy answer. Then said, something mutual. The millionaire nodded. And what does mutual mean? Both people choosing. Exactly. The host leaned forward. Then remember this tonight. Your honesty is your choice. Their answer is theirs. Your soulmate understood. This was not a story about destiny removing free will. It was not about heaven forcing two people together. It was about truth creating the possibility for two people to finally make informed choices. And my child, that distinction matters for you too. Your value does not depend on whether another person finally recognizes it. Your life does not need to remain suspended while someone learns courage. You are allowed to grow. You are allowed to require consistency. You are allowed to listen to words while also observing actions. You are allowed to care deeply without abandoning your own peace. Your soulmate was beginning to understand this about you. And strangely, it made their feelings more serious. Because they no longer wanted a version of you who simply waited. They began respecting the version of you who could choose. The version who had standards. The version who had learned from disappointment. The version who might look at beautiful words and quietly ask, what will you actually do differently? That question frightened your soulmate more than rejection. Because words were easier. Actions required transformation. If they said you mattered, they would have to behave as though you mattered. If they said they wanted honesty, they would have to stop disappearing when conversations became uncomfortable. If they wanted another opportunity, they would have to become consistent enough to deserve consideration. The dinner had begun with one question about you. Now it had become a confrontation with who your soulmate needed to become. The millionaire saw the realization forming. You know, sending the message was the easy part, right? Your soulmate smiled nervously. I'm starting to realize that. Good. The host lifted their glass slightly. Because confession is a moment. Character is what happens afterward. Your soulmate never forgot that sentence. The evening slowly approached its end. Guests began preparing to leave. Chairs moved. Goodbyes were exchanged. Numbers were shared. Future meetings were discussed. Yet your soulmate barely remembered any of it. They were thinking about the phone in their pocket. Still no response. They walked toward the exit. The millionaire accompanied them part of the way. Before they separated, the host asked, "What will you do if they don't answer tonight?" Your soulmate thought. The person who had arrived at dinner might have said, "I'll assume they don't care." But the person leaving gave a different answer. "I'll wait. And tomorrow? I'll respect whatever they choose." The millionaire nodded. "And if they do answer?" Your soulmate smiled faintly. "Then I'll stop hiding." Those words mattered. Because your soulmate was no longer promising themselves a perfect ending. They were promising a more honest beginning. They stepped outside. The night was cooler now. Cars moved through the street. The city continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But for your soulmate, the world felt subtly different. They had said something they had been afraid to say. And somewhere, those words were traveling toward you. They reached their car. Opened the door. Then the phone vibrated. Your soulmate froze. One vibration. That was all. But their entire body reacted. They pulled out the phone. There was a notification. For several seconds, they could not bring themselves to look. They laughed quietly at themselves. They had spent the evening speaking with millionaires and influential strangers without nervousness. Yet one notification connected to you had completely undone their composure. Finally, they looked. And what appeared on the screen was not what they expected. It was not a long response. It was not an emotional confession. It was something much simpler. Something that made the situation even more intense. You had seen the message. That was all they knew. No reply yet. Your soulmate stared at the screen. The truth had reached you. Now the silence belonged to a different moment. Before, silence had been theirs. Now they were the one waiting. And suddenly they understood you in a way they never had before. This was what uncertainty felt like from the other side. This was what it meant to wonder. To wait. To examine a screen. To imagine meanings that may not exist. To wish another person would simply say what they were thinking. Your soulmate sat inside the car but did not start it. Minutes passed. They promised themselves they would not send another message. They almost broke that promise twice. Then they remembered the guest's advice. Give them space. So they waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. The city lights reflected across the windshield. Your soulmate finally started the car. But before they could leave, the phone vibrated again. This time, a message appeared. Your soulmate looked down. And the first few words made their breath catch. Because your response, whatever form it took in this fictional story, did not simply answer their confession. It revealed that you had been carrying a truth of your own. A truth your soulmate had never considered. Something about the past. Something about why you had become quieter. Something about the moment they thought you stopped caring. Your soulmate began reading. Their eyes widened. The millionaire's question from earlier returned instantly. If this person walked through that door right now, would anything else matter? But now there was another question. A much harder one. Because your message revealed that there had been one specific moment when you had almost told your soulmate everything. You had almost admitted what they meant to you. You had almost taken the risk they were finally taking tonight. But something happened. Something your soulmate did not know about. Something you saw. Something you heard. Something that made you pull back before they ever understood how close you had been to choosing them. Your soulmate read the message again. Then a third time. They whispered, "I never knew." And suddenly the entire history between you began rearranging itself. A silence they had interpreted one way meant something completely different. A decision they thought you made casually had actually come from hurt. A distance they assumed meant indifference may have been self-protection. Your soulmate realized they had spent months understanding one of the most important moments between you incorrectly. And the truth was bigger than anything revealed at the dinner. Because if what your message said was true, then there had been a moment when both of you were waiting for the other person to speak. both afraid, both uncertain, both interpreting silence, both closer to honesty than either realized. And then one misunderstanding changed the direction of everything. Your soulmate gripped the phone. They knew exactly which moment you meant now. They remembered where they had been. They remembered what they had said. They remembered who else had been there. And most importantly, they finally remembered one detail they had completely forgotten. A detail that explained why you might have misunderstood everything. Your soulmate stared through the windshield. No. Because the person you had seen them with that day, the person whose presence may have changed what you believed about your soulmate, was not who you thought they were. And your soulmate suddenly realized that one explanation, given at the right time, might have prevented months of distance. Their fingers moved quickly toward the screen. They started typing. Then stopped. Because explaining that person was only the beginning. There was another secret connected to that day. Something your soulmate had never told you. Something they had originally planned to reveal much later. And now, after everything that happened at the Millionaire's dinner, they understood that if they wanted a truly honest beginning with you, they could no longer reveal only the comfortable half of the truth. They would have to tell you everything. Your soulmate stared at your message. Then began writing again. This time there was no hesitation. But before they pressed send, they whispered a sentence that would change the direction of the entire story. If I tell them what really happened that day, they'll finally understand why I disappeared. And that, my child, was when your soulmate realized the question asked at the Millionaire's dinner had opened a door neither of you could easily close again. Because the next truth was not about whether they loved you. It was about why they had walked away when their heart was telling them to stay. And the answer was something you had never been told.